Executive Director. I'm Executive Director of the Coalition for Peace Action, and we welcome you tonight. We're honored tonight to have an outstanding diplomat and scholar presenting to us on Distorted Visions, How We Ended the Cold War but Lost the Peace. Let me introduce our speaker. I'll give you a little bit of an overview. After Ambassador Matlock speaks, for something like 45 minutes, he's using a PowerPoint, which you can see the first slide of it already there. And after he speaks, we will have a Q&A period. The way you can ask your questions is through the chat box. And when you go into the chat box, select my name, and then I will see your questions and I will ask those. Sometimes it'll be a condensed version of it, or I'll group several questions together, but we'll get as many questions as we can get in. And I think we'll have something like 35 or 40 minutes for the question and answer period. And then I have just a few announcements of other upcoming events before we finish, and we expect to finish by 8:30 at the latest. Ambassador Jack F. Matlock, Jr., during his 35 years in the American Foreign Service from 1956 to 1991, Ambassador Matlock served as ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1987 to 1991, Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, and Senior Director of European and Soviet Affairs on the National Security Council staff from 1983 until 1986, and Ambassador to Czechoslovakia from 1981 to 1983. Since his retirement from the Foreign Service in 1991, he has held academic posts at Columbia University, Princeton University, I think some of you may have heard of that university, Hamilton College, Mount Holyoke College, and at the Institute for Advanced Study, where he was George F. Kennan Professor from 1996 to 2001. It's my honor now to turn the microphone over to Ambassador Jack Matlock.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to address your group. You know, I think we're living now in a very difficult time, a time that our own country seems deeply divided, and yet we also have involved ourselves in numerous wars abroad. Now, I have to wonder how it is that we moved in just over 3 decades from the sort of confidence that enveloped America when the Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall came down, and our first President Bush proclaimed a new world order. Is that the world we're in today? I really don't think so. And particularly, things have reached, I would say, a sort of a height of disappointment with the war in Ukraine. Now, when I think about how this has happened, obviously, I know that there are many, many reasons, many of them complex, but some of the most fundamental is our failure as a nation to understand the lessons that the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union should have taught us. Now, I think many people think that the Cold War ended when the Soviet Union collapsed, and it collapsed because of Western pressure. Actually, both of those assumptions, I think, are incorrect. and I'll explain why as we go along. Now, when I look back over that, you might say, the 3-year period between 1988 and 1991, 3 geopolitically seismic events, as I would call them, because they shook up, in effect, continents. 3 things happened, not just one. The first was the Cold War ended. And it was certainly ended by 1989, although in many ways it was ended by the end of 1988. And then, with no Cold War and attempts by Gorbachev to reform the Soviet Union, the Communist Party step by step lost control. It had been in control since the end of the Civil War in 1919, 1920. But gradually, by 89 and 91, the Communist Party lost control. And then at the end of 1991, the Soviet Union shattered into 15 independent states. Now, these were connected events. They were not sort of isolated from each other. I would say that in all 3 cases, most observers from the outside looking in missed what was happening. But let's just look at that for ourselves. Now, the Cold War ended not with the victory of one country over another, but on terms that were negotiated first by Reagan and Gorbachev, and then completed by our first President Bush and Gorbachev. As I said, it took 2 to tango. But by 1989, they were dancing to the same music, which was in effect an agenda that we had set 3 years earlier for trying to end the conflicts with the Soviet Union. When I say we, I mean we in the US government. Now, the Communist Party lost control when Gorbachev maneuvered it out of control with democratic reforms. This was not a result of Western pressure. Gorbachev was doing it because he understood that's what his country needed. And so he then began to actually take the Communist Party step by step out of control when the officials of the party began to resist his perestroika, his reforms. And then the third was that the Soviet Union shattered into 15 independent states in 1991. At first, the 3 Baltic countries, which had declared their independence, were recognized as independent by the Soviet State Council. But then in December, at the end of December, the other 12 Soviet republics, led by Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, simply ended the Soviet Union. At that time, the United States had hoped that Gorbachev could create a voluntary federation of those 12 republics. We had always thought that the 3 Baltic countries should be independent. We never recognized officially that they were part of the Soviet Union. And one difference today we need to remember is that actually the Soviet Union freed them after their declarations of independence before the Soviet Union broke up. Now, let's go back to first and how did we negotiate that? Well, we had been, I would say, when President Reagan first was elected to office, the Cold War was about as deep and hostile as it had been for a long time. Not as dangerous maybe during the Cuban Missile Crisis earlier, but we were locked in to positions and simply a very little communication after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. But in looking at the situation, we decided that in order, if we were going to get anywhere, we needed, first of all, to seek cooperation and not, you might say, concessions or capitulation. Second was to offer reciprocity. Everything we expected them to do, we would commit ourselves to do. Another thing, instead of simply arguing things out in public, making speeches, making offers that you knew they couldn't accept, and arguing, and we would consult privately in advance if we were going to propose something. And then we knew that we had to understand the political position of the other leader and their political needs. And very important that we would stay in touch and communicate constantly. Now, in looking at that, there were powerful forces in the Reagan administration. In fact, most of his staff before George Shultz sent me to the staff were convinced that you couldn't negotiate with the Soviet Union. You just had to confront them and force them. That the system was not really legitimate because there had been a revolution to create it. That we had to keep military superiority, and that our goal should be to break up the Soviet Union. These, President Reagan agreed to leave off our agenda for very good reasons. If you challenge their legitimacy, how are you going to convince them voluntarily to do what you would like them to do? And second, the whole idea that we were in an arms race that had, if these weapons had ever been used, it wouldn't simply destroy civilization once. There was an argument over whether it would be enough for 7 times or 20. There were over 60,000 of these weapons. And we were, of course, we were building because we didn't want them to have more than we had, and so on. But it was clear that if we came to an agreement, one side would not agree to the other to have military superiority. Now, that doesn't mean that at times, our negotiating tactics seemed to be that way. But certainly for President Reagan, he said, no, equality is enough. And he particularly disliked the doctrine we had regarding nuclear weapons, if there was an attack on the United States, we had to retaliate. Said, there is simply a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought. And the best way to make sure of that was to avoid military superiority and cut back on the actual, it seems in retrospect, insane buildup of nuclear weapons. And finally, it was not a goal to force the collapse of the Soviet system. Of course, we thought communism was a lousy system. But as President Reagan would say sometime, if that's what they want at home, it's none of our business. It is our business when they start forcing it on other people. was that we wanted to end the latter. Now, Gorbachev's speech in the UN, December 7, 1988, completely discarded the Marxist-Leninist theory which lay behind the Cold War. The Cold War was really about communism. And Gorbachev replaced what the Marxist class struggle, which had been the basis of their domestic and foreign policy since the communist victory in the Russian Civil War. He replaced it with the common interests of mankind. Now that may sound simple, but this was profoundly important because for Marx and for Lenin and Stalin and even Brezhnev, the later leaders, there was no such thing as the common interests of mankind. There was only the class struggle, and their job was to have a revolution to bring the proletariat in power and eliminate the bourgeoisie. So this, in a you might say philosophical sense, this was a profound thing. And he announced that countries have freedom of choice of political systems and alliances. And he also reduced the Soviet military by 500,000 troops without reciprocal. And then in November 1989, the Berlin Wall was taken down. I want to keep my talk within 45 minutes, but I would just say that the people who say that they brought the wall down because Reagan demanded it, which of course he did in a speech at one point when he stood in front of the wall and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." But it happened later when President Bush was president. And at that time, President Gorbachev, I think, was very concerned about the rhetoric coming out. And after a concert by an American musician, he had me and my wife come up to the box afterwards, and we chatted. And then he took me aside and said, "Please ask your president to be more considerate." Well, he used the Russian word I would translate as considerate. And I asked him, "Well, what specifically?" And he said, "No, just that." Well, of course, I sent that to President Bush, and I told him, "I think he's thinking about your trip to Eastern Europe," because Bush had planned a trip to Warsaw and Budapest. And I said, "Please, he doesn't want to tear down the wall speech. He wants that wall down probably, but he's got to maneuver so that the Germans do it themselves. They're the ones that put it up." And so actually when Bush went to Warsaw and Budapest, he talked about Gorbachev's perestroika and the favorable changes. And in effect, that gave Gorbachev more elbow room to tell the Germans he was not going to come in and save them again. And of course, the details of the wall coming down. But it's interesting how so many of these myths, and you go to the Reagan Library and it has actually part of the wall, and with his speech, "Tear down this wall." And I say, when you look at it, yes, that speech was nothing wrong with it because they did need to tear it down. But actually, it was enabled by not making this a public issue and rather doing things that encourage Gorbachev to continue his policies. So I'll have to rush along, but the next, I think, big turn in December 1989. And of course, 1989 was the year that all of the East European countries, following that speech in December of 88, all of them threw off the communist government. And for the most part, it was peaceful. There was fighting in Romania, but for the most part, it was peaceful. And the agreement in there, when Bush and Gorbachev met in Malta, first of all, we no longer consider each other enemies. And then Gorbachev vowed that the Soviet Union would not intervene in Eastern Europe as it was throwing off its communist countries. And President Bush said that the United States would not take advantage of changes there. Now, then the next year was the year that the two Germanies united. And, you know, many people now wonder about, well, is it true, as President Putin has accused us, that we promised not to expand NATO? And I would have to say, we certainly left the impression that we would not expand NATO. There was no legal requirement, and, you know, I don't know, there could have been a legal requirement, you know, binding, you know, future governments. But when Secretary of State Baker was meeting with Gorbachev and trying to persuade him to enable a peaceful uniting of the East and West Germanys, he started by saying, assuming there's no expansion of NATO to the east, not 1 inch, then he argued, wouldn't it be better to have a united Germany anchored in NATO? Implying so we don't want a Germany that again will dominate Europe or go nuclear and do these things. And Gorbachev answered, well, that obviously any expansion of NATO would not be acceptable, but that he understood the arguments made, and he made it pretty clear that he might accept this, which of course eventually he did. And the 2+4 agreement, which was the external agreement allowing the Germans to unite, was signed in September. And it did not, well, it did have a provision that no foreign troops could be stationed in what had been the territory of East Germany. But I would also say that I think the Germans and the British gave even firmer guarantees than we did. So that this happened under an understanding. And as I said, the formal agreement at Malta was that we would not take advantage, vague words perhaps, of their retreat. But anyone in those days would have said, well, Gorbachev received assurances that were not legally blinding. Now, the second geopolitical transformation was that the Communist Party lost control. And these steps, things were happening very fast. The presidency was established, giving Gorbachev more power formally than he had before. Before, his power rested a good bit on approval by the Communist Party Politburo. And now he was at least legally more in control. But independence movements were growing in the non-Russian republics. Lithuania was the first actually to declare independent. But then by 1991, I have to leave out a lot of detail. There was an attempted coup d'etat in August that attempted to remove Gorbachev. It failed, but it so weakened him that very quickly the Soviet Union broke up. And now Gorbachev at that time was trying to negotiate a voluntary federation. This is something that President Bush supported So one of the ideas is that, it was a victory for the United States when the Soviet Union broke up. It was not. It was the opposite of what we wanted to happen. Of course, we were glad that they were doing away with the communist system, but we would have been very happy to live with a voluntary federation of 12 Soviet republics. But in December, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus met and decided to liquidate the Soviet Union. Then Christmas Day in 1991, the Russian tricolor was raised over the Kremlin, and Boris Yeltsin, who had been elected as leader of the Russian Federation, received the release keys for nuclear weapons, which is sort of the ultimate power symbol. I'm going to have to rush ahead, but let's think back in 1992. Europe was free and undivided. There was an economic collapse in Russia, Ukraine, and in most ex-Soviet republics. The United States and our allies in Europe declared victory. I would sometimes think back, and I remember one of the things when President Reagan wrote before he met Gorbachev the first time. He wrote a note sort of to himself and shared it with a few of us. But one of the last things he said is, whatever we achieve, we must not call it victory, because that will just make things more difficult in the future. So, yeah, and then we set out to make the world over. Anybody remember Francis Fukuyama's End of History? Here's a direct quote. What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Doesn't that take your breath away? Is there any historical reason to think that assertions of this sort, well, of course, it grows out of some of our philosophers who were constantly telling us that, we're moving inevitably to a more uniform civilization and so on. Very little evidence of that. But that was the basic philosophy, which I think has dominated much thinking of policymaking since. And it reminds me of what had been the Soviet Brezhnev doctrine. Well, that was that socialism, as defined by Marx and Lenin, was the future of the world. And it was the duty of what they called socialist states collectively to defend socialism from internal and external threats and to spread it throughout the world. Then what is the unipolar illusion that I would say possessed our thinking? That it is now the ability and duty of the United States to spread democracy and maintain a liberal world order. Well, you need to look behind some of those nines, but it seems to me that those two doctrines, with the change of just a few words here and there, are almost identical. Now, of course, we were talking about we were the only superpower. Well, what does that mean? Yes, we had the most powerful military. We had the most productive economy. But if it's military power, what kind of power is that? It certainly can destroy, but can it build? I can't think of much else it is. Well, let me just briefly run through events. We went through, 8 years of the Clinton administration. Unfortunately, although there were some real achievements of the Clinton administration, there was no strategy developed for the post-Cold War world. Then there were missed opportunities. Arms reduction virtually stalled. Almost all of our arms reduction treaties had been done earlier with Reagan and the first Bush. There was no Middle East peace, despite the attempts, in Norway of bringing the Palestinians and the Israelis to an agreement. There was a war against Serbia without UN Security Council approval. Our defense posture was not really changed as a result of the Cold War ended. We just explained it in different ways. And we began to extend NATO to include countries of Eastern Europe without building a structure for European security that included Russia. But as Clinton missed opportunities, the second Bush, George W. Bush, destroyed many of them. He could have prevented 9/11, but he did nothing. I would say he was asleep at the switch. And then he attacked Iraq without UN Security Council approval or solid allied support based upon lies. When we talk now about how terrible it is for Putin to invade Ukraine, and it is terrible, do we forget that we've had a president who did exactly the same to a country that did not threaten us and lied to do so? Well, he walked away from important treaties that were the basis of ending the Cold War, such as the ABM Treaty. He dropped the verification of nuclear reductions. He proclaimed an attempt to dominate the world. And as all that was going on, he turned the budgetary surplus into a deficit. All of these wars were conducted off budget. Now, I presided over a real estate and financial boom that burst and made the United States the world's largest debtor. At the end of that administration, the majority of the people in other concerns considered the United States the greatest threat to peace. And let's see how then during his administration, Russia becomes a problem. At first, Putin was the first learned leader to call Bush after the attacks. And he actually helped us when we went to Afghanistan. In return, we continued to leave treaties and to move NATO closer and closer to Russia without, again, a structure for Russian security. By 2007, Putin did make a speech objecting to what he called our monopolistic dominance. Now, President Obama at first seems to try bring things around. And however, their definition of what it would take had some defects. When Secretary of State Clinton went to Moscow, she carried a big a button which had in Latin letters Perigruska, and thinking that this means to reboot and reset the relationship. I know when they used that word in English. A Russian friend said, you know, I don't think we need a reset. We need a different operating system. But it turned out that this was ironic because not only was the word not put in Russian letters, but the Russian word перегрузка means overload. It doesn't mean reset. Reset is перезагрузка. Now, why is this significant? Well, it was, in effect, a good description of what became a two-pronged US policy. We were willing to cooperate when our interests coincided, but we were going to support democratic forces and Western values within Russia, which means getting deeply involved in their internal politics. And we were also going to deny any Russian sphere of influence by getting deeply involved in the internal politics of the newly freed republics. And then increasingly, it would seem that this was directed at President Putin personally. They did sign a new arms control agreement, one that, by the way, President Putin a few weeks ago suspended. Now, that was the last arms control agreement we had with Russia because we had walked out, not Russia, we walked out of all the others over time. Now, in the Russian view of US policy, and some of these accusations are undoubtedly exaggerated, but we have to understand that others act on their perceptions. Their perceptions are not always accurate, but they're going to act on perceptions. It was that the US is seeking world domination. We talk of ourselves as the leader, or we like to at that time, and as President Obama would announce, we're an exceptional country. Well, I think President Putin would say we're an exceptional country too. Now, democratization was used to unseat governments not under US domination. Our response to the Arab Spring has actually strengthened terrorists, and the US wishes to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO to create a ring of military bases around Russia. And he charged when we began to deploy missile defenses in Eastern Europe that they could be used offensively, which was essentially correct because we were using the same missiles that we had designed for the Navy to use either for offense or defense with only a software change. And then our media has become, I would say myself, so Russophobic. Almost everything bad reported and exaggerated thing, and sometimes simply fabricated. So his conclusion that our aim was to humiliate the Russian leaders and encourage regime change in Russia at least. It's ironic somehow that later we seem to go crazy about the idea that Russia might have interfered in our elections. No actually evidence that it had any effect on the election in 2016. But anyway, there was more and more actually public, personal invective. Now, time is going on, so let's back up a little bit and look at some of the basic problems behind the war in Ukraine. If you can look at this map, you'll see that the borders of Ukraine that were sort of handed to the Ukrainians in 1991 when the Soviet Union broke up actually covered territory that had changed over the years, the whole definition of what was Ukraine. and the area, which is essentially Galicia and some of the others, had never been part of the Russian Empire until Stalin brought them into the Soviet Union in 1939, and then at the end of the war, occupied them. The interesting thing here is that traditionally they had been in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and then in Poland, but not very happily. They are the center of what has become an extreme form of Ukrainian nationalism. The Crimea, which had never been in Ukraine until 1954, was simply transferred at a time when that meant nothing to Ukraine. But even there, Russia kept the city of Sevastopol and their naval base there under Moscow's control. Now, the languages in Ukraine, as we can see, you'll get from proportion of Ukrainian speakers to Russian speakers. You'll see a clear division back east and west. And finally, in voting, you'll see that on one side, you'll get heavily votes on one side and those on the other. Now, so Ukraine has been in many ways divided. And in 2014, there is a turning point that there were demonstrations in Ukraine pressing for membership in the European Union, not NATO at this time. It was European Union, and the actual proposals that the EU made to start a process of union were very unfavorable to Ukraine in the sense that they required things that the Ukrainian thought he couldn't do. But President Yanukovych, who came from the Russian-speaking area, fled when violence erupted in Kiev. It is almost certain that violence was started by these far-right militias that came from Galicia, because they had started attacking the government offices. Unfortunately, Ukraine had a constitution that allowed the elected president to name what we would call the state governors. And so the violence actually started in the West. Then actually the United States was actively involved there, trying to sponsor a change of government. I say, would we allow how would we react if the Chinese, for example, were in Mexico City trying to enforce a change of government? We'd go ballistic. Russia then held a referendum in Crimea, which is largely Russian speaking. It was totally peaceful. Now, of course, they should have let the UN supervise it, but and I'm sure that probably 90% of the votes that voted yes, well, probably should have been more like 70%. But there's no question that the people of Crimea preferred to be in Russia rather than Ukraine. Then there was, when there were more and more attacks on Russians, there was a rebellion of Russian speakers in the Donbass. Now, Ukraine attempted to retake it by military force, and Russia gave informal support. That is, they not through their uniformed armed services, but they gave support to the secessionist people. They asked for transfer to Russia, and they were turned down. But therefore, they set up what they call, a semi-independent states. Now, let's go to the Trump years. Relations didn't improve despite Trump's earlier comments about working with Putin. The whole Russiagate accusations, of course, virtually tied his hands politically. And although there was absolutely no rational basis for those, Russia had done much less in their propaganda and so on to interfere in that election than we had done for years, interfering in elections in many other countries. Then we began expelling Russians and, of course, diplomats, and of course, they would expel ours. We have gone down to almost skeleton cast in our diplomatic efforts to cooperate, to communicate. And then, of course, the principal US media began to carry on a very, I would say, almost a Russophobic campaign. Now, what's the situation today? I think that there can be no victors in the war in Ukraine. And the longer the fighting, the more people will be killed and the more damage to the international system. The overall goal of weakening Russia, I believe, is not in US interests. We are driving them to cooperate with China, Iran, many others, to have to end US control, of financial transactions and other things. And we also have to remember the big mistake after the First World War was trying to make Germany the sole victim and hold them down. Then we got the Second World War. And so the challenges of the future, global warming, pandemics, failed states, terrorism, refugee flows, are going to require the cooperation of all countries, especially the largest and most populous. And the fight over where the borders are drawn would be to repeat the mistake of the First World War. And the longer the war in Ukraine continues, the more likely weapons of mass destruction will be employed. Now, once again, very quickly, I see a great similarity between the Brezhnev Doctrine and what we call the liberal world order or the rules-based order. When I almost have to laugh when I hear rules-based order. Okay, what country first started wars without a declaration of war, invaded other countries that weren't threatening them? The United States. The NATO attack on Serbia was, without UN approval, was illegal. And then the US attack with some partners on Iraq was clearly a basic violation of international law. And I would say we have developed internally the practice of letting our president go to war without a declaration of war, which is required by the Constitution. Our political system has, in fact, created an authoritarian president who can take us to war without a declaration by Congress. So it seems to me that what we need to understand is that our policy, foreign and domestic, is in many respects not serving our national interests now. We're trapped in never-ending wars, politically split at home into antagonistic factions, tied to allies whose interests are not the same as ours, estranged from potential partners, and our current policy threatens a new North arms race at best and a nuclear war at worst. And so our policy, I think, has become much too concentrated on militarism and the use of force to solve problems. We need to learn more from an understanding of history. For me, one important lesson is that the future of the world and indeed of mankind will not be determined by geopolitical competition for control of territory. The most serious challenges transcend national boundaries and can be managed to overcome only by international cooperation. Now, there are a lot of mistaken ideas, and I'm just going to list them because my time is virtually up. And I have to say, I often use these arguments with my students. First of all, control of land and people equals strength. No, trying to control land containing people who don't want you to control them is weakness. That one's goal should be to maximize power. Well, power for what? Is it power to destroy, power to compel somebody to do something they don't want to do? And is power a hierarchy? Well, certainly in some sense it is, but do more powerful nations have rights or privileges denied others? Is it okay for the US to invade Iraq and not okay for Russia to invade Ukraine? I think they both are wrong. And then too often we speak in generalities, we put labels on things, we assume things that are not necessarily true. As for the generalities, the old slogan that the devil is in the details, I like it better when you say, angels and the devil are in the details. You've really got to look at the details. And labels, what do they distort or obscure? Metaphors, do they really fit? We're using the metaphor of war for almost everything. War on drugs, war on terrorism, well, Cold War. These are quite different things. And the problem with calling them war is you instinctively think, well, if it's war, you got to win. And you win by using military force. And I think that we need to be more careful. And historical analogies. Is the war in Ukraine Munich 1938 or Europe 1914? And that's when nations finally interact through people. Human psychology is more important than political theory. And now, I have a few quotes here, but we'll have to remember that I think that when Senator Fulbright, the only senator who from the beginning voted against the war in Vietnam, wrote a book which I found very interesting. Power tends to confuse itself with virtue. And a great nation is particularly susceptible to the idea that its power is a sign of God's favor, conferring upon it a special responsibility for other nations. And, he goes on to say at times that if you want to spread democracy, the only way to do it is to show how it works at home. You don't do it by trying to force it upon another country. And then let us not forget that one of our greatest warriors, when he was president, Eisenhower, in his farewell speech, warned us against the military-industrial complex. Unfortunately, since that time, it has become congressional military industrial, because we have, a military that has put military production in almost every congressional district in this country. And now finally, I love the quotation by John Quincy Adams, which he made in 1821. And it's in beautiful prose. Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will America's heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. And then look at the conclusion that she well knows that by once enlisting under other banners than her own, were they even the banners of foreign independence, she would involve herself beyond the power of extrication and all the wars of interest and intrigue, of individual avarice, envy, and ambition, which assume the colors and usurp the standard of freedom. The fundamental maxim of our policy would insensibly change from liberty to force. The gauntlet upon our brows would no longer beam. With the ineffable splendor of freedom and independence, but on its stead would soon be substituted an imperial diadem, flashing in false and tarnished luster, the murky radiance of dominion and power. If that does not describe our policy today, I have trouble finding fault with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Matlock, for that in-depth, penetrating. Yes, let's show our appreciation for Ambassador Matlock, and we can probably take down. There we go. Okay, I was just going to say, let's take down the PowerPoint. That was very thoughtful and challenged a lot of the assumptions that I think we make as we think about issues of internationalism and of war and peace. So we very much appreciate that. Again, please, if you have a question you'd like to submit, please put it in the chat box and choose me as the person it goes to, Reverend Bob Moore. And I have some questions already in there, so we'll start with those, but we can add more. So please keep that in mind. And we have a good amount of time still. We have probably at least 20 minutes, 20 to 25 minutes for questions. So please do think about what you'd like to raise. Ambassador Matlock, first question is, what is your assessment of the performance of Michael McFaul, who served as the U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014?
Yeah, I'm very reluctant to comment sort of personally.
Sure.
You know, I consider him a personal friend. I got to know him in the 90s. I think his time there was most unfortunate. I would say, you know, he's a political scientist, and I think that his analyses of Russia's problems in the 1990s were very profound. Somehow, I've known some political scientists who I think were fine diplomats, but in a way, I think that by so openly making common cause with the president's opposition, that was, I think, bound bound to create problems. And of course, he had written even before he went to Russia that Russia's unfinished revolution. So it was very easy, I would think, for President Putin to consider him not someone who was going to try to work out the problems, but someone who was going to try to change the government and get him out of it. And I think that's unfortunately, he's a fine person. He understands Russia, but I think his stint there was hardly successful.
Thank you. So we have some other good questions coming up, and let's just start going through some of these other questions. What practical suggestions do you have for us to help make peace in the world?
Well, basically, if you're talking about the war in Ukraine, we should be pressing very hard on the Ukrainians to make a deal. There's simply no way they're going to have a successful country by reconquering the areas which contain people who don't want to be under their rule if they are going to be considered second-class citizens simply because they speak Russian. So I think that, continuing simply to give arms there. Now, I would say that I do think that if Russia were trying to conquer Ukraine, as initially it looked as if they did, we certainly should help Ukraine, not be totally overrun. But the situation there is to have peace, you're going either to have Ukraine give Russian speakers equal rights and not treat them as if they are not Ukrainian, or else you're going to have to let parts of them go to Russia, or maybe be sort of independent enclaves for a while. But they're going to have to be, given all that has happened, some border changes. And quite, it may sound politically not good to say so, but I think the Chinese proposals are probably the best I've heard since then. And the thing is, we could have prevented that war by giving assurances, valid assurances, that Ukraine would not be part of NATO. And yet, although they were not part of NATO, we were secretly having special forces there training those that were fighting in the Donbass. And, this is what infuriated Putin, which doesn't say that his invasion was right or a good thing, but I'm just saying that our double standards are rather infuriated to some of us that can see that there are both sides of this. Now, if you're thinking otherwise, certainly we should not be challenging China to the degree we are. Of course, we're going to be competing in some areas, but they have 4 times our population. And it's not a catastrophe if their economy gets larger, should be larger. So, this idea that we got to be number one,
Right.
I can't agree with that.
Yes. Thank you. Another question, was the Ukrainian Revolution of 2014 illegitimate?
Was it
Illegitimate.
illegitimate? It resulted in, first of all, a coup d'etat, and then an election which did not include the areas of Ukraine that are in dispute. Therefore, the current government was not elected by the people in the areas it claims. There were elections, but prior to that and after that, there were the 2 Minsk agreements, which required Ukraine to adopt a federal system and give a certain degree of autonomy to the Russian-speaking areas, and this was flatly refused and repeatedly. So the the failure of the United States to give assurances that Ukraine would not be in NATO, and was actually from the Trump administration on supplying offensive equipment to them and even trainers on the ground. That was secret. But Putin, of course, knew it. And so you had the combination of the Ukrainians not following or implementing agreements they had made, and also the United States continuing to treat Ukraine as if it were a NATO member, even if it were not. And so I think the provocations certainly were there if one wants to understand what Putin's perceptions were. And yes, I don't agree with some of his historical analysis and so on, but as I must say that again and again, we have to understand what the other side or what other people perceive and deal with that rather than simply making demands that we ourselves, placed in a comparable situation, would not exceed to. That's what worries me.
Yes, thank you. Another question. Many people in the US, including many in Washington, believe that Putin is determined to rebuild the Russian Empire, and the US therefore has the responsibility to, quote, weaken, unquote, Russia or defeat Russia in Ukraine,
Yeah, I
even
think that's
threatening
totally
nuclear war. Is this an accurate
First, thank
assessment
you.
of Putin?
First of all, yeah, I would say first of all, Ukraine and Russia this is a special case because of the historical intimacy between the historical Ukraine and, you might say, Galicia. There are competing concepts of what it means to be Ukrainian. No, but also, I think that, Putin himself has said that anyone who does not regret the collapse of the Soviet Union has no heart. Anyone who wants to recreate it has no brain. He hasn't said that recently, but that was originally his idea. Now, obviously, I think that what he is reacting to, and first of all, suppose, as I pointed out, we in the first Bush administration, we thought that a federated Soviet Union of 12 republics, minus the 3 Baltic states, was in the interest of the United States. So what should we have against? The thing is, if we had a structure that guaranteed Russian security, then it would be much easier to for democracy to develop there and also in the closely neighboring states. One of the things the pressure is doing now is that I think certainly Putin is going to insist upon much closer ties, and they're already very close, but maybe absorbing Belarus. This is strategically very important. And so making ourselves the enemies by directly involving ourselves in internal politics, which we have done for over 20 years in these republics, doesn't help them. It just pushes them in the other way. And I'm old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. Actually, I was in Moscow then, translated Khrushchev's messages to Kennedy. I don't know very well how we reacted when Khrushchev quite legally placed nuclear weapons in Cuba. Legally, because we had placed weapons in Italy and Turkey that could reach the Soviet Union. And so if Cuba asked for protection, they had every right. But of course, we had to react, and we did in a way that, as luck would have it, kept us from a nuclear war. But the thing is, one keeps, first of all, this idea that he simply wants to reconstitute either the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, I don't think he has that in mind at all. And I think he would have been perfectly happy to live with the borders that Russia had if he did not see an attempt by the United States, using also allies in Western Europe, to surround Russia by bringing these countries, Ukraine, Georgia, centuries in Russia, in a Western alliance which was hostile to Russia. I mean, this is a bit crazy, but in any event, as what we've seen in Ukraine, he doesn't have the power actually to do this militarily, but he certainly will try to use any attempt by the US to influence these countries and to bring military bases. The sensitivity is much more to the presence of bases, military bases in these countries than it is the so-called protection of the Article 5, which says that we'll consider any attack on these countries as an attack on the United States. Back in the 90s, when we were considering expanding NATO, I know the Russian ambassador told me we were friends. We had known each other for 15 years or so and worked together. He said, we don't care about your giving a guarantee, that you'll defend them if they're attacked. I said, we're not going to attack them, but what we don't like is you're putting military bases there. Why do you do that? We're not threatening them. So this is part of the issue. I think all sorts of accusations are made. Oh, for example, that these are authoritarian regimes now in Russia and China. Therefore, we have to oppose them because they want all other countries to become authoritarian. It's nonsense. The authoritarians are authoritarian within their own country to control it. And are we ignoring the fact that we're becoming more authoritarian ourselves, particularly in the use of military power abroad? The Cold War was about communism and the attempt of the communists to actually basically change society and government throughout the world. Of course, this was a dream that was not going to come true. And of course, socialism never operated the way Marx had predicted. It was almost the opposite. All of that aside, I think the same idea, now that, we've got to oppose authoritarian governments. Often that authoritarianism is a reaction to our own policies. And I think we have to understand that.
Very good, thank you. And by the way, it was fascinating that you translated Khrushchev's messages during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That brought to mind how that crisis was actually solved through quiet diplomacy. Thank God that President Kennedy had the wisdom to open that backdoor channel, because otherwise we may well have had the use of nuclear weapons at that time. So diplomacy, not war, is one of our campaigns, and we believe very much, very strongly that that's the right way to go.
Okay.
One more question. Is President Biden's State Department more extreme and less qualified than President Reagan's State Department?
I think that I think our current Secretary of State is really quite different from President Reagan's Secretary of State, George Bush. And I think that unfortunately, the current State Department are true believers in you might say the liberal world order, if you want to call it that. And I critique that. And also, you know, we're following in many ways a different policy, because Reagan's policy and Bush, and also Bush, but particularly George Shultz, Secretary of State Shultz, believed in staying in contact. And also, neither of them would ever personally, publicly criticize the Soviet leader. They were true diplomats in the sense that, and I think that, President Reagan was not an intellectual with a lot of, detailed knowledge of history, but he was a decent person, and he understood how to get along with people. And, instead of demonizing them publicly, as we have been doing with President Putin, yes, Reagan would criticize communism, and was very anti-communist, but he never personally denigrated in public a Soviet leader. And when he met them personally, normally his first words were, "We hold the peace of the world in our hands. We must act responsibly," and listen to what they had. George Shultz, one of the things that we were most interested in was human rights. But did we go public with a lot of accusations? Well, for a while we did, and I know that President Reagan wrote in this memorandum to him, almost to himself and staff, before he met Gorbachev, we're too upfront on human rights. We can bang at them publicly and get applause from our bleachers, but it won't hurt the victims. In fact, it could it would not help the victim. In fact, it could hurt them. And when we developed our policy on human rights, what we said was we must cooperate to improve observance of human rights. We didn't say, your thing, you got to reform. No, we must cooperate. As a matter of fact, we put every goal, one, that we must cooperate to achieve certain ends. And when our Secretary of State met with Shevardnadze, he had just been named foreign minister. The first time, he started out giving him a list of victims. We called it our humanitarian list, and asked them to do something about it. And Shevardnadze said, "Well, yes, I'll take this back, but can I discuss with you the status of Blacks and women in your country?" And the Secretary of State said, "Of course. I think we're making progress. We're not there yet, and we can use all the help we can get. Now, you'll go about it this way. And in fact, in one of his meetings between Schultz and Shevardnadze, and I was present at that meeting, he handed Shevardnadze our list of what we call representational cases. And Shevardnadze took it and said, well, I'll take this back to Moscow, and if I can confirm what you say, I'll do my best to correct it. Paused. Then he said, but George, I want you to know one thing. I'm not doing this because you asked me to. I'm doing it because it's what my country needs to do. Those two men stood up there, and Schultz put out his hand and said, Edward, I will never ask you to do something I do not think is in your country's interest. This is the spirit of diplomacy and negotiation, and we made more progress quietly. Now, of course, there was a lot of public talk, but it's one thing, you know, when you have human rights organizations, private organizations, it's very important for them to bring the facts to light, but for the government to beat on another government publicly, particularly when actually our record was certainly not 100% in these areas either. But so I think that simply understanding how human beings operate, after all, despite all of the political international relations theory, countries are led by people. And I do think that our current leaders are following a quite different philosophy from the one that the secretaries of state I worked for, George Bush, and you know, also Baker, the Secretary of State for the first, George Schultz and Baker. These were two fine diplomats. My current Secretary of State, I think, is just following different practices, and I would call them, many of them, non-diplomatic.
Right. Thank you. And let me give one last question, and then we'll do a final thank you to you, and I'll make a few closing announcements. What should replace the liberal world order in your view?
I think it's very hard to come up with a formula that can't be misunderstood. But I think the recognition that there are other civilizations in the world, and they do some things differently from the way we do, and that there needs to be a sense of live and let live, a return basically to what we would call the Westphalian system. Another thing I would say is that I really wonder about our definition of human rights. I think what we were really talking about is civic rights, because actually just being born a human being gives you no rights. I'm reminded, you know, this saying where everyone is born free, but now is in change. Nonsense. We are born like other higher animals, totally dependent on others. And so it is up to the political system that we create to create the rights and the balances that make society operate. So I think the idea that our idea of human rights, and we seem to be expanding the list constantly, and at home, that's a good thing. But when you start dealing with other people, often with histories much longer than ours, think of China. I mean, they're going to create their systems. And yes, there are things we can do that will encourage them to be more democratic. But you start talking about you're going to keep them from developing too fast, or you're going actually to keep them from unifying what they consider their country, and we'll do it by military means if necessary. You know, I don't think this is going to work, and I think it's going to bring about quite a different world than the one that we would like to have. So that it does seem to me that you don't. One thing, of course, we don't allow anyone to interfere in our politics, and we should understand that they're likely to react negatively when we interfere in theirs. And if any country has, over the last decades, been deeply involved in the internal politics of other countries, it's been the United States. And frankly, through my career, I supported much of that for a lot of reasons. But looking back, it's clear to me, at least, that this doesn't work in the long run.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Matlock, and we will finish at 8:30, but let's show Ambassador Matlock our appreciation. And if you could just stick with me for 2 more minutes, I just want to announce a few of our upcoming events too.
Thank you. Hope I can
Thank
visit
you.
My old home in Princeton again sometime soon.
That would be great. That would be great, Ambassador Matlock.
Okay.
So I just wanted to mention a few things that are on our website that I hope you will also plan to join us for. One is that Earth Week is coming up around the Earth Day.
Okay.
And
I'll
the
leave you
webinar,
then.
we have.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Sure.
Okay,
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. So we're having a webinar on water, source of life, and development of the Earth as part of our Earth Week webinar, and it's going to be on Wednesday, April 19th. What is that? 8 days from now, from 7 to 8:30 p.m. We have 3 outstanding speakers, diverse outstanding speakers. A high school student who's become a leader on the world stage, and a number of real experts on the issue of water. So that information and the ability to register for that webinar, all of our webinars require pre-registration, is on our website, peacecoalition.org. And then also we're on Sunday afternoon, June 4th, Sunday afternoon, June 4th, we'll be having our annual membership program. This is a members only event, so you have to be a 2023 member or else a donor or pledger to Coalition to attend this. It's going to be hybrid, and our keynote speaker I'm really excited about is Dr. Trita Parsi. He was a founder and longtime leader for the National Iranian American Council, but right now he's the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute, a highly respected think tank in Washington. He will be our keynote speaker, and I think it's going to be a great evening. By the way, Dr. Parsi's, one of his op-eds just in the last few weeks in the New York Times was that on the subject that New York and the United States is no longer the indispensable nation. And as we saw, China is stepping forward to play a lead, more and more of a role in diplomacy, and recently, got the diplomatic relations restored between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and that is paying a lot of dividends, including being a key step toward finally ending the horrific Yemen war. And that looks very hopeful that we're on the precipice of permanently ending that war now. It was shameful, of course, that the United States was supporting that militarily with Saudi Arabia. So Dr. Trita Parsi, that's going to be in person at Christ Congregation here in Princeton. And again, the details are at our website. We don't quite have the registration ready yet. We started working on it late this afternoon, but within the next day or so, you'll be able to register. But for now, please do hold that date. He's a truly outstanding speaker and writer and thinker. And I think it's an occasion you won't want to miss. Again, thank you all for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a great rest of your evening. Good night.